Welcome back to Gimme Some Truth. I'm Clint Walkner. This is Keith Poniewaz. He is going to be our resident crypto expert today. Something that you love.
I thought I was going as the crypto curmudgeon.
Yeah, you are kind of the crypto curmudgeon. That's true. I mean, we could have done a whole podcast on gold too, if you really wanted to get deep in it. But yeah, we could add that later.
All of my favorite things. Yeah. Though I have evolved my position on gold for the time being.
Oh, good. Well, maybe at a future podcast we'll have to dive into that one. This is a new thing here. Okay, good. There's been a lot of legislation that has been bantered about, and some of which have actually become law. And so we wanted to talk a little bit further about the Genius Act and stablecoins and what sort of impact it might have on U.S. expats specifically. Because I think one of the challenges that you guys have and clients have is sending money back and forth. How do you do it safely? How do you do it cheaply? And, when we have multiple residences, multiple bank accounts across the border, what can happen there, and what might be some ways to, some new ways that people might be able to send money more efficiently. So we'll start just kind of by answering the question here, why are we talking about crypto and stablecoins again? And then also, some of the basic differences between the two.
Yeah. So crypto, I think, stablecoins, crypto we're mostly familiar with. It's basically the idea was to build a medium of exchange based on the blockchain where you could prove ownership by kind of doing all these calculations, mathematical calculations with your computer. The goal of something like Bitcoin was essentially a limited quantity of coins that, people could kind of mine and discover. I mean, you might say it was functioning a little bit like digital gold. The problem with, crypto, Bitcoin, these sorts of things are kind of multifold, I think. First is there a guarantee that there's actually a limit on how many that can be mined, right? Mm-hmm. Second, it's become a place for rampant speculation. Whether it's, the meme coins that we've seen or that sort of thing, which has kind of taken away some of that, usefulness. And I think that idea of speculation works directly against it as a currency, right? So if you have a currency, it's supposed to be a stable store of value. One of the reasons why inflation is such a bad thing, high inflation is such a bad thing, is that if I wake up in the morning and my dollar is worth $1 and by the afternoon it's worth 90 cents or 80 cents, in hyperinflationary environments, that's not great, right? And so with crypto and the high and huge swings, if I want to pay you in a Bitcoin for a product or a service online, and I give you 1 Bitcoin now, and then suddenly that Bitcoin is worth, and it's worth $10,000, and in the afternoon it's worth 15, the incentive is not there for me to use them as a method of exchange. And so stable coins are a little bit of a way to kind of harness some of the good things about, crypto, that it can be used hypothetically by unbanked populations. It can be, totally digital. It can, if need be, bypass the banking system. And what it is basically a coin, internet coin, a cryptocurrency that's linked to a basket of secure assets, a currency. So that's what part of the reason we're talking about it again is the United States government has started taking steps towards regulating these, because we've seen a number of these quote unquote stable coins blow up. They're very much like, I would say, money market funds, in that you buy a fund and it's backed by interest-bearing securities, treasuries, US dollars. And that's what they're trying to do here, is make a 1-to-1 correlation between if you have a stable coin and a US dollar, essentially.
That's right. Yeah. A US dollar or dollar type security. Yeah. Correct. So, about, I think the number was like 98 or 99% of all stable coins now are backed by USD. And there was some examples of this, some big examples of Tether having a small issue there in that the fact that they actually broke the buck, and that's just basically saying that the basket of securities was no longer valued 1-to-1 with US dollars because they actually were using different securities. So enter now the Genius Act, which is basically providing us a regulatory framework here in the United States, really, around what stable coins are. And so basically, you have to have US dollars or US dollar equivalents backing it up. So it can be treasury bonds, things like that back up this security, and has to be domiciled in the US. So we now onshore these. And you could see why that is, right? Because US government wants US dollars to be the currency that these cryptocurrencies are really denominated in. It does make us kind of that world leader in cryptocurrency and really does help out the US dollar.
Well, and it helps sales of US Treasury. Actually, I read a piece by JP Morgan, friend of the podcast, Jack Manley, wrote it.
Yeah.
And they talked about how basically now these stable coins are purchasing as much as 5% of U.S. Treasuries, which, is a pretty significant as, we maybe move away from China and Japan buying our treasuries. That's, maybe something that's going to slide into that place. There are some things that I would say are right now with stablecoins that the Genius Act don't cover. And one of the big things is a lot of these are still offshored, right? And they haven't moved to the U.S. because in a lot of ways, the lack of regulation for the people running the stable coins is in some way kind of the point, right? When you look at who's right now using stable coins, we've seen huge growth in places like Iran and Russia, countries that have, strong sanctions against them. And so a, more unregulated payment scheme is what's driving that growth, right? They're kind of been cut off from the international. So if they want to remit money, move money to relatives or that sort of thing, these stable coins are now the place to go. So that's, one of the kind of issues there. So I think, and then the other reason why we're talking about them now is there was initially, speaking of remittances, in the one big, beautiful budget bill, blah, 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 there was a carve out there was originally a kind of proposal for a remittance tax. So what does that mean? If I send money, and this was very not fleshed out and has basically more or less been eliminated. The only place where it really comes into effect, I think, is if you show up at a wire transfer office, a Western Union or something like that, with a big bucket of cash, they're going to charge you a tax on it. But one of the carve-outs was specifically for these stable coins that if you were remitting money, wiring money to another country, if you used a stable coin, there would be no tax. And so that's the other reason. The final version of the bill has kind of largely eliminated that advantage, but that was one of the other reasons why you're seeing more talk about these stable coins.
Yeah, and to go back to your earlier point, it seems like there's about a 3-year period now where these companies have to now kind of onshore, run out of the U.S., be more regulated. So from that perspective, they have to be audited, and they have to prove that they have USD backing what they say they have. So the coins are indeed 1-to-1 in valuation. And so it will change the fact that it will change a lot of the things with payment remittances. And you're seeing a lot of these companies figure out how they're going to go about doing that. The theory is that you'll be able to send money back and forth, these stable coins back and forth without a lot of tax on them, essentially, as far as from governments, as well as wire transfer fees. You kind of avoid a lot of that. There will be a fee, I'm sure, but it kind of depends on how much that fee is going to be. And, we're seeing less than 1%. We'll see what that fee actually is between providers. But a lot of these payment networks are seemingly updating to using a bit more on stablecoin payments now going forward.
Yeah, I mean, remember, and I think, this kind of jumps to, one of our kind of questions or discussion points we had talked about of, the drawbacks possibly of stablecoins. And I think hidden fees or fees may be the thing. When I send a wire to another country, there's obviously a fee, right? There's the, depending on the wire company, depending on the bank, there is a charge. It can be as low as $15 or $25. That's what Charles Schwab charges. But there's also, in many cases, a spread, right, that they charge on the exchange, the moving of US dollars to euros. And a lot of banks, they say, oh, our international wire fee is only $50, but then they charge a 1% spread. And the example I give is always when you go to the airport, they have a huge spread, right? Don't change money at the airport. If you haven't figured that out yet, that's my piece of advice to you going forward. Don't change money at one of those little currency stands you see on the road, because those are, huge. They take a huge spread. And, for a long time, credit cards, because they process so much, actually did a pretty good job of keeping the spread pretty small. And so one of the pieces of advice was, if you were traveling abroad, use a credit card. And Schwab still has a debit card with no ATM fees. The spread on taking money out on that, from an ATM card from your US dollars is pretty good. So that's, a good low cost method of getting cash in many cases. But that spread, the buy and the ask, the bid and the ask, the buy and the sell, as they will put it on the airport sign, like I said, can be 2 or 3%. And that's why companies like Wise have gained in popularity. There are a number of services like Wise, and people come to us with a new one kind of every day, it seems like. And what they offer is a fixed rate of exchange, and a very, clear cost to you. Here's the wire fee, or here's the spread we're going to take. Generally, it can be between 0.35 and 0.5% on most major currencies, right?
And they're dealing with traditional banks and things like that. So it's not like they're going on this other rail system in there. They're utilizing banks.
Yeah, basically what they're doing is batching together a whole bunch of transfers, getting that mid-market rate, and then going from there. Certain brokerages will offer better rates. We partner with a couple of brokerages, StoneX and Interactive Brokers, where you can get a little better. In many cases, though, because they're brokerages, they don't want to be treated like banks. So if you need to send money instantaneously, not as good, right? Not as good a method. For bigger amounts of money, you can talk to your bank. If you're, moving $200,000 or $400,000 to pay for a house, they can help you with that. There are also services out there that will help you lock in a fixed rate if you're worried about that, if you're buying a house or something like that. So there are a number of options out there. It takes a little due diligence. Because we don't have custody, we can't do many of those for our clients, but we're aware of them, have frequently talked to them, and kind of spoken to them about the methods that they use, so we understand the underlying kind of things. So I think that's where, there may be a transfer charge for me to send a stablecoin to you, but the other place is going to be the brokerage charge, right? Taking those dollars and moving them into stablecoin may be the other place where you may see a hidden fee, and that could be a little bit of a problem.
It could be a problem. And also, until everything is fully regulated, until they're onshored, we know that these coins are going to work. And I don't know, from my perspective, I'd be a bit uncomfortable sending $500,000 via stablecoin, knowing that sometimes if we type some wallet addresses incorrectly, that money is gone. And so going through the banking system,
having the checks,
checks and balances there probably will be a bit more beneficial. Perhaps we'll be a lot more, hardened to all of that and be totally fine with it in a few years from now. But as of right now, proceed with caution, I would say, if you're sending large amounts of stablecoins. It's not like buying a pizza.
Yeah. No, I think, if you want to try it out with your friends, I owe, my friend in the UK $50, the kind of thing that maybe we use Venmo more for in the United States. Maybe stablecoins will work really well for that kind of thing, but a lot of big money transfers. The other thing is, because they're still largely unregulated, they're susceptible to break-ins. I mean, cyber break-ins. North Korea has a whole unit dedicated to hacking crypto accounts because once they're gone, it's like the old bearer bonds, which like most people, I probably got familiar with watching, James Bond movies or something like that, where those are a bond where if you held it, that was your money, right? It was sort of like cash, right? And the same thing can be, if I steal that crypto, that's now mine, and I can offload it, and you've lost it, and you have, especially with the lack of regulation, with them being offshore, less recourse. The other thing that's happening in Hong Kong is also looking at pursuing this, and I think this is the other thing to be aware of. We don't know how these will affect money laundering regulations in other countries, right? Here in the US, the goal is to get them kind of in line so they're less of a money laundering kind of, implement. We don't know how other countries treat them yet. Hong Kong is putting into account legislation to kind of hopefully get crypto within their setup. But again, we don't know if that's going to work, how that plays with the U.S. rules. And we're still waiting to see on many other countries how they're going to handle these, because they are right now a tool for money laundering. They're a tool for, like I said, Russia and Iran, countries that are excluded from the banking system right now, for residents of those countries to get money back and forth. So there are a lot of questions, how they'll be regulated, how they might be taxed, how they might be treated. Will they, raise an audit? A lot of people go, oh, if I send $10,000 USD, it's going to, get notification to the government. Why don't I just send $9,990? Well, they can still track those, and those are equally suspicious. So if they're seeing a lot of transfers from, stablecoin going to your account, how is, the government of France, the revenue collection of the UK going to look at that?
Well, and by the way, it's all stamped in the blockchain. So,
yeah,
I think I always find some humor in some of that, all of those transactions are stamped and they think that they're going to be non-traceable. That's very difficult to do. Let's go back to one item too that you did kind of mention in passing, but for U.S. expats too, taxation, when you send money back and forth, can be a bit of an issue as well, and not as transparent as it may seem.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you're using something like a stablecoin or a cryptocurrency, if you are just trading currencies, right, you have to report those profits in the US. So if you're moving money in to a stablecoin and then moving out to is that a currency trade? Is the amount of time that it's sat in that currency, and maybe the stablecoin went up against the other currency, does that suddenly become the sort of transaction where you're liable for tax? Maybe not in the US with things like the Genius Act and that, but in the country of residence. I put it into a stablecoin for, $1 to 1.10 for euros. All of a sudden the euro goes up to 1.15 and I move it out. Do I have to pay tax on that 5-cent difference? Yeah, if it's a pizza, not such a huge deal, but if it's, house level money, or I'm moving monthly expenses or that sort of thing, those are some of the things that I think we just don't know yet how various countries are going to treat them. So, from our standpoint, we want to be a little cautious. I mean, it's the same thing with most of the Bitcoins, right? How are they going to be taxed if you decide to unload them? And, what is that going to look like?
Well, and people that transact in crypto oftentimes have, multiple different coins, multiple different wallets. And all of a sudden now I convert my $50,000 of Bitcoin to stable coins. I don't really think about it. And lo and behold, you've just sold perhaps some really low basis, cryptocurrency that's treated like property in the US from a tax perspective and could be treated in a different manner from a foreign jurisdiction. So there's some major issues there that you've got to be careful about.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
anytime you're kind of making these intra crypto transactions, you got to pay attention and get to know how your local tax authority is treating them. So, before I think the advice would be to be cautious before you start going, I'm going full stablecoin on all of my, transactions here, especially since I've got this Bitcoin that, can help fund this, I think is something to keep in mind.
Right. And I think these stable coins are going to be big for countries that just have huge currency fluctuations, kind of that sort of cryptocurrency problem that you talked about with Bitcoin going up and down so much. Real currency risk exists in certain countries. And so I do believe we're going to see that as a method of payment in many cases, but it's a matter of will the other person on the other side accept that? Mm-hmm. And then, how are these all going to be taxed, as you're alluding to? As well. So,
yeah, a lot of countries, particularly in Latin America, made a decision to basically tether their currency to the US dollar already. In certain cases, this is a way for basically, maybe if you're not in one of those countries, for people to stabilize their holdings, right? And be able to say, okay, yep, I've got these things. And especially in many cases where you may not have the offer of being banked in the US or being able to get into USD, this may be an opportunity for those folks to move it and stabilize it. I just think stable coins are a case where we take for granted regulation in the banking industry in many cases, and you're exposing yourself to risk. Now, if you're operating in a country where maybe the banking system is less regulated or more ripe for corruption or those sorts of things, then I can see that, kind of coming in as a particular use case. And in a lot of cases, that's where we're seeing the growth in the use of these stable coins. One of the things I'm interested in is if we see more of these stable coins, what does that do? And you're more of a crypto, student than I am to things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. What are we investing in if we're putting money in them?
I think that's a very valid question now. I think that the original thought behind cryptocurrency was going to be that it was going to be a stable form of payment for goods, right? And now it's become a whole speculative carve out. And is that still an investable asset? And I think for some of those, the answer is still yes, because of kind of the rarity and the perception of value. But if that perception does go away of that value, I could see a huge correction there as well. I would say in allocations, proceed with caution, right? And then we're seeing some wild numbers from people in our industry stating, oh, we'll have 10 to 20% of your assets in crypto. And I'm like, I don't know about that. Yeah. That seems, I don't know. That seems to be very interesting advice. I'm not there yet.
Well, that's a case where I always wonder, the famous Latin expression for lawyers, cui bono, like who benefits, do you have a investment in a crypto that you're looking to drive up? And so that's, some of the questions. I do think, clients have, over time asked us about allocations to crypto. I think as a firm, we're less hesitant. We think it's more maybe something that, if we're talking about core and satellite, something you can try in the satellite portfolio, good for the boat fund, as one way to look at it, especially for international investors, though, with the tax questions and all those sorts of things. Those are things you want to make sure that you're really aware of and on top of before you make that kind of investment. Because remember, for Americans abroad, you're liable on that in the U.S. and in the country where you live. And, are they taxed in the same way as the sale? Because, with securities, we know they're both going to be treated capital gains tax in both countries, very similar, but do they go in different columns on the tax forms? Mm-hmm. In which case, then you are going to be double taxed hypothetically. So there's just still not a lot of clarity around that sort of thing that you need to kind of keep in mind.
Exactly. I mean, there's more accessibility now with ETFs, things like that, but there's still no stablecoin ETFs. It's really just Bitcoin and Ethereum right now in ETF form. So it's a little easier to access. I would check with your advisor to see if you want to talk about those sorts of things, but agreed on the core versus satellite. It's definitely not in our core. Our investment committee really in our core models has none in there presently. It's not to say it will never show up, and we do customize for some clients and add it, but in general, it's a very small allocation, if at all. So thanks for joining us today, Keith, on the Stablecoin podcast. If you have any questions, comments, please leave those in there, and we'll see you on another episode of Gimme Some Truth.
Walkner Financial Advisors is a registered investment advisor with the SEC. Registration with the SEC does not imply a certain level of skill or training. The opinions expressed by the participants of this podcast are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Walkner Financial Advisors. All statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. Information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. Information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. Thanks for listening, and for further information, please visit walknercondon.com.